So I think I want to start by really appreciating us being here in our group. And you might remember a while back when we talked about the Maha blessing. What is the greatest blessing? And I wonder if I have it nearby. Let's see how close it is. Well, it's probably not that close. But there are maybe, I don't know how many stanzas are in it, 8 or 10. And one of them is about the circumstances for hearing the teachings. And this always has struck me that even when it might be a complicated teaching that I don't understand, or maybe I'm hearing it again a few times, I've heard it before and something different clicks each time. And so I just wanted to quote that verse number 8 from that sutta, the Maha Blessing. Right reverence and humility, contentment and a grateful bearing, hearing Dhamma when it is timely, this is the highest blessing. And then it's listed some general occasions for hearing the teachings. Sacred days like full moons and during Buddhist festivals, and then when disease and suffering sometimes make one thoughtful enough to want to understand the truth of suffering and ready enough to find a way out from the suffering, or when the mind is especially inclined toward the teachings, like when we do a concentrated meditation practice for some time, like in retreat. Sometimes unskillful thoughts have invaded the mind, and they haven't really taken full possession of us yet, so we can take ourselves to a Dharma talk or to the sitting cushion to really see what's going on. Sometimes at the time of death, when the concentration of mind can condition a thought about rebirth, or so there are these different ways and times of listening to the Dhamma. And now one of them, which is difficult at this time of night, is there shouldn't be any undue tiredness of the body or mind, because this distracts attention and makes one sleepy. And there are many times in Dharma talks and retreats where I have fallen asleep during the Dharma talk. But I've encouraged myself to realize that the words are flowing over me. I might be sleeping partway through it, or I might find it difficult, but it's still, timely hearing of the Dhamma is a great blessing. And because of it, the 5 hindrances can be abandoned for a while we're sitting here. And even the 10 fetters, there can be more awakening from hearing the Dhamma at times, whether it's something that we might understand clearly or not so clearly. Because this talk on the 6 sense doors comes under clear comprehension, and it's part of being mindful of the Dhammas. And so, in the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha identifies that the origin of suffering, dukkha, is craving. And he talks in his very first sermon about the chain of dependent origination. And he identifies that craving arises from sensations that result from contact at the 6 sense bases. And so to overcome craving and its resultant suffering, we should develop restraint of and insight into the 6 senses. And so in doing some review and some of my notes I thought I might back up a little bit and simply saying, what most of us know, but the first sermon had a very long name, Dhammacakkappavattana, and it meant the turning of the wheel. And he only gave it to his 5 ascetic companions that had supported him during his quest previously, and then they abandoned him. But when they saw him on the path, they saw that he was completely liberated. And so during that first talk of his, he described the 4 Noble Truths, that, the truth of universal suffering, dukkha, and the origin of the suffering, and the cessation of the suffering, and the path leading to the cessation of suffering. And, we've heard this a few times, but birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, death is suffering, association with unpleasant is suffering, dissociation from the pleasant is suffering, not to receive what we want is suffering. And so, in short, the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. And these 5 aggregates of clinging are form or matter, feeling, vedana, perception, sana, mental formations, sankhara, and consciousness. Those 5 aggregates constitute this whole psychophysical complex, or mind and matter, that we wrongly identify as I or me. And the Buddha's second truth, the cause of suffering, is craving, tanha, which is one of 3 types. There's craving for sense pleasure, there's craving for existence, and there's craving for non-existence. And then the third noble truth, that by completely eradicating craving, suffering can be eliminated, and we can attain this state of nibbana. And the fourth noble truth of the path is the Eightfold Path, consisting of right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And we've been going through this in our Tuesday class in our study of Joseph Goldstein's book on mindfulness. And so, having described craving as the cause of all suffering, then the Buddha described the conditioned arising nature of craving and suffering. And that's where he began this dependent origination, that conditioned by ignorance arise mental formations, and conditioned by mental formations arises consciousness, and conditioned by consciousness arises mind and matter, and conditioned by mind and matter arises the 6 sense bases. Conditioned by the 6 sense bases arises contact, and conditioned by contact arises feeling. Conditioned by feeling arise craving. Conditioned by craving arises clinging. And this is how we see becoming happening, that by craving and clinging, then conditioned by clinging arises becoming. And conditioned by becoming arises birth. And then conditioned by birth arises aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. So in the dependent origination, the Buddha has stated that craving arises due to feeling, which arises from contact at the 6 sense bases. So that gets us to the 6 sense bases, that in the Buddha's literature, the 6 sense bases are also known as kind of sense media, sense spheres, or sense doors. I see your hand raised, Cynthia. Let me finish this one train of thought, if I can, because I can't hear you right this minute. I'm sorry. My speaker's not turned on. So give me a minute to finish this one train of thought here. So those 6 internal sense bases, the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, touching, and the mind, those are the internal sense bases. And the external sense bases are the objects, the visual object, the sound itself, the smell, the taste, the touch, and the mind object. And so the first 5 of those internal sense bases are material, while the mind is non-material. And contact with the external world is maintained by receiving sense objects through the sense bases. Visual objects through the eye, sound through the ear, smells through the nose, taste through the tongue, touch through the body, and mind objects through the mind base. And it's through these senses, these sense objects, that a living being experiences the world. And by reacting to sense objects received through them with craving or aversion, we build up these mental defilements that lead to suffering and continuation in the cycle of birth and death. As far as any living being is concerned, these 6 internal sense bases and the 6 external sense bases together can be described as constituting the experience of our life. All conditioned things are arising and passing away, and we see this clearly from each of our sense bases. And there's, in the Samyutta Nikaya, a collection of the Buddha's connected discourses, where the Buddha describes all 12 aspects of the sense bases and the sense objects as all, and that no one will be able to describe anything else as all. It's just those sense bases, internal and external, is all. So what is all? Simply the eye and visual objects, ear and sounds, nose and smell, tongue and taste, body and touch, mind objects. This is what the Buddha called all. So I'll pause there and I'll ask you what you wanted to say. Let me turn my speaker on.
Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. So maybe this is a semantical thing, but I've been lately, I've been suffering a lot lately. And so I'm trying to work with that through the Dharma. And okay, so they're suffering. I got to acknowledge that they're suffering, and the cause of suffering is clinging and craving, and trying to pay attention to what am I clinging and craving to. But what's the difference between clinging and craving? I mean, maybe that doesn't matter, but
well, I think craving is what you see arising, and clinging is what we do if we're hanging on to it. So we can crave a pleasant experience, but if we don't cling to it, it will remain impermanent. We will be able to see its impermanence, and we can see that it arises and passes. So craving is the cause of that clinging.
The craving is maybe a little bit more of an automatic thing that we don't have so much, like pleasant experience arises, and the just sort of automatic tendency is to want to grasp onto it, and the clinging is the part that that we have more choice about when we notice it. Oh, I'm really hanging on to this. That's not going to serve me. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a good. I think that's a good way of looking at it. So I don't have to say a whole lot more about this, except in this one of these contemplations of the Dhamma, the Buddha said, "Whatever you see, you must be mindful of as it really is, and whatever you hear, you must be mindful. You must be aware of it as it occurs, and whatever you smell, you must be aware of it as it really occurs." And whatever you taste, you must be aware of it as it really occurs. Whatever you touch, you must be aware of it as it really occurs. Whatever you think or you think about, you must be aware of it as it really occurs. And so he teaches us to be aware of all 6 of the sense spaces and all 6 of the sense objects, and those final kinds of consciousness, being aware of the thinking as it really is. And so when we see a visible object, the consciousness of seeing arises dependent on the eye, one of the 6 sense spaces, the visible object. And when your eye has contact with the visible object, then there arises consciousness seeing it. So consciousness of seeing arises dependent on the eye and the visible object. The eye is one of the 6 sense spaces, and the visible object is one of the 6 objects. So when you see something, you have to be aware of it as seeing, seeing, seeing. As long as you see it, the invitation is to be aware of it and to note it. And when you note the consciousness of seeing, it means that you note the eye and the visible object too. Because when there's no eye, E-Y-E, when there's no eye and when there's no visible object, the consciousness for seeing doesn't arise. That can happen quite a bit while we're sitting, because if our eyes are closed, well, the eye is there, but the eye is not coming to an object. And so consciousness of seeing arises dependent on the eye and the visible object. And so if we observe the consciousness of seeing, then it means that we observe the eyes and the visible object, and whenever we see something, we watch that thing that's seen, and what we need to observe is seeing, the consciousness for seeing. Because when we observe the visible object, which is seen, then we note seeing, not object, but we note seeing. So when we note seeing, it's the consciousness for seeing, the seeing itself, not the visible object, not I'm seeing the bird, or I'm seeing Cynthia looking back at me. It's consciousness is around the seeing, the object of the seeing, but not noting what it is we're seeing. That takes us off into a storyline. So whatever we see, if we're aware of it by making this mental note of seeing, whatever we hear, we're aware of by making this mental note of hearing. Whatever we smell, we observe the consciousness of smelling, making the mental note smelling. And whatever we taste, we're aware of it, making a mental note tasting. Whatever we touch, we observe as touching. Whatever we think about, we want to be aware of it, and we make a mental note of it as thinking, and so on. So when we hear some sound or voice that's an audible object, that consciousness of hearing arises, dependent on the ear and the audible object. Same thing with smelling. Smelling, and then consciousness for smelling arises. dependent on the nose and the sense door. And when we note tasting, the consciousness for taste arises dependent on the tongue and the food. And when we know touching, the consciousness for touching arises dependent on the body and a tangible object of some kind. And when we note thinking, that thought arises dependent on the mind and the Dhamma, and that is and what it's thought about. So these 6 sense spaces or sense doors, the term door is used especially for 3 of the bases. They're literally translated as door. The eye door, the ear door, the nose door. The tongue is a sense door. The body is a sense door. And the mind is a sense door. So the sense door eye is, they have these different Pali names. And why the 6 sense spaces are called doors is because consciousness comes to our mind through the eye, in this case, when we're talking about seeing. Sometimes these mental states come to the mind through the ear, or through the nose, or sometimes through the tongue, and sometimes through the body, and sometimes through the mind. So they're called the doors. Sometimes you see pictures in Tibetan tankas of a house that has, I think it has 5 windows and a door. And so those are the sense doors in the house. When you see Tibetan tankas of those 12 dependent origination cycle, you'll see one of them as the sense doors, and it's represented as a house. So, when you see, say, a beautiful flower, a beautiful rose, and we realize that the rose is beautiful and its scent is really sweet, and then we judge, like, there arises this pleasant feeling about the rose, and when we feel a pleasant feeling, then what arises? Attachment arises to the rose, to the feeling, or to the rose, and there's this pleasant feeling. There's attachment, and then that arises dependent on the feeling, and the attachment is, to the rose. So then if the flower is not beautiful and it's ugly and produces a bad smell, then when we see it, how do we feel? Pleasant or unpleasant? Usually it's unpleasant. And then we judge the flower as, whatever, wilted, ugly, you don't want to see it anymore. Then what mental state arises? Aversion and anger. I've actually enjoyed practicing leaving bouquets of flowers in their vases for a long time after while they're dying, to watch the whole process of changing. I don't have any judgment about the flowers dying, but I have to say I change the water. Because if I leave the water in there, I definitely have an aversion to, arriving to the nose door is smell, and I have, a direct attachment, some kind of, craving to it that, so, this is how, whatever we smell has to be observed, whatever we taste has to be observed, whatever we touch needs to be noted. And this is how to close the 6 sense doors so that any of those defilements can't come into the mind. If we open the door, then these mental defilements, the 5 that we know, or the 10, if we know all 10 fetters, defilements are just waiting right outside the door to come into the mind. So when mental defilements are waiting there, are we lucky or are we unlucky? Is there sorrow there, or worry, or anxiety, or strain, or stress, or depression, or anxiety, or anguish? A lot of suffering comes into the mind through these sense doors. And so it's really important to try to be aware of each of the sense doors and the awareness of the purity of seeing, or smelling, or tasting, or touching. or the thought door. Sometimes you practice walking, and there's a place for walking, and it might be narrow and small. And sometimes when you pass each other, if you're doing this on retreat or something, you sort of look askance because you're not looking at each other. And then something might come through of pleasant or unpleasant, or, at least maybe there's some disturbance of some kind. Our concentration is disturbed by the consciousness for looking or seeing. And then our concentration is gone. And sometimes through that contact, the eye and the visible object, if any desire, attachment comes into the mind, then we suffer. Or any aversion or anger comes into the mind through the eye door, then we suffer. And, it's sort of pointed out that we suffer because we don't close the sense doors. We don't close the doors. Someone asked in one of the, Sherry.
Is all suffering because of the sense doors?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because
isn't it about practice?
Yes.
So there's no way to turn off the sense doors. What you're talking about is that it's kind of this whole saying, be here now. So being present, moving through without attachment.
Yeah. The observation of it.
Yes.
Yeah. The observation of it. That's why.
Oh, that's good. All done.
Yeah. Over and over and over.
Got that.
Over and over and over again. Yeah. One of the things that I was looking at and referring to, which goes into the dependent origination, there is a way to overcome it, but the overcoming is by being with it and noticing it purely, and noticing when consciousness arises too, because there's the eye door and there's the object that we see, and then there's the consciousness that arises that we then make this note of. And so throughout the Pali Canon, the sense bases are referenced in hundreds of discourses. And in these diverse discourses, the sense bases are kind of contextualized in different ways, and it includes the sextets, the sense bases in these two sets, the 6 sense organs, internal sense bases, and the 6 sense objects, external sense bases. And then it's based on these pairs of sense bases, then a number of mental factors arise. So when an ear and sound are present, then that associated consciousness arises. This always makes me think of the Zen koan, of if the tree falls in the forest and no one's there, does it make any sound? Still a good question.
Or one hand clapping.
Yeah. So the Buddha taught that really in order to escape the dangers of the sense bases, that we have to be able to apprehend the sense base without defilement, without grasping or clinging or pushing away. So in abandoning the defilements or in abandoning the fetters, the Buddha states that one abandons the fetters when one knows and sees as impermanent. This is in the Samyutta Nikaya 35. The 6 sense organs, objects, sense consciousness, contact, and sensations. Similarly, in Uprooting the Fetters, which is Samyutta Nikaya 35.55, the Buddha states that one uproots the fetters when one knows and sees as nonself, anatta, the aforementioned 5 septets. To foster this type of penetrative knowing and seeing, and the resultant release from suffering, in the Satipatthana Sutta, it's Majjhima Nikaya number 10. That's a really big sutta that's worth going over many times. So the Buddha instructs the monastics to meditate on the sense bases and the dependent arising of the fetters or the defilements. And he says, "O bhikkhus, does a bhikkhu live contemplating mental objects in the mental object of the 6 internal and 6 external sense bases? Here, O bhikkhus, a bhikkhu understands the I and material forms, and the fetter that arises dependent on both I and forms. One understands how the arising of the non-arisen fetter comes to be." So you might be able to understand how it arises before it arises. We've addressed this before in right thinking, seeing a thought that might be unskillful, or trying to see it before it arises. So one understands how the arising of the non-arisen defilement comes to be. One understands how the abandoning of the arisen fetter, the same thing in our thoughts from before when we were talking about it. You abandon it, you try to see it before it arises. If it arises, you abandon it when it arises. And one understands how the non-arising in the future of the abandoned defilement. So here we are talking about the trying to see it before it comes, letting it go if it's there, and seeing that if it doesn't arise in the future, we can understand how non-arising in the future of that abandoned fetter can come to be. One understands the ear sounds, the organ of smell and odors, the organ of taste and flavors, the organ of touch and actual objects, consciousness and mental objects. One lives contemplating mental objects and clings to naught in the world. Clings to nothing in the world. So that's probably complicated enough, but I think I might end with one of our favorites, Deepa Ma, who's also, pointing to the aspiration of freedom. The purpose of insight meditation is to eliminate the 10 fetters, which are the knots or obstructions in your mind, very slowly, by observing every moment with awareness. You come to open these knots. The 10 fetters are self-illusion, that's the illusion of a separate self, doubt, attachments to rites and rituals, lust, ill will, craving for fine material existence, conceit, restlessness, and ignorance. At each stage of awakening, slowly, one by one, some of the fetters are extinguished until the last stage of arhatship, when all the fetters are gone. The fetters are related to birth in the same way that oil feeds the light of a lamp. The fetters are like oil in your mind. As the oil becomes less and less, the light from the wick becomes less and less. Finally, when the oil is gone, the light is gone. Once they are extinguished, the cycle of rebirth ends. From this, you can understand that birth and rebirth are in your hands. With that, I will thank you for listening to the Dhamma, and let's take a few minutes of silence to let all of those busy words swirl around and see what arises from it.